Today we are making this adorable bumblebee cake. It is made with moist chocolate cake layers, honey buttercream, and then it has some fondant facial features and wings just to really bring it to life. Speaking of fondant, that's actually the first thing we're going to work on for this cake. The wings are pretty thick and they need a little bit of extra time to dry, so it helps to make them first. It's also best if you can let them rest overnight if possible. To make the wings nice and symmetrical and to make it really easy to cut them out, I actually like to use a large heart-shaped cutter, and then we just kind of cut off the bottom of the heart. This works so well. You just want to make sure that you roll your wings out thick enough so that you can easily insert your skewers into them so that you can safely secure them onto your cake. Once those are all ready to go, we're going to set them aside to dry and work on our bumblebee's eyes. I like to add little white dots to the center of them just to really give them an animated look. And then I also use circle cutters to make the little bumblebee's mouth. This part is optional, but if you have a little bit of pink fondant on hand, you can make little cheeks to make your bumblebee look nice and jolly. And then it's time to work on our bumblebee's antenna. Now for this, I just roll out some small bits of fondant, and I actually use some skewers that I painted with a little bit of gel food coloring and vodka that are mixed together. It kind of makes an edible black paint. And once I painted the skewers, I set them aside to dry as well. And then the last thing we're gonna make is our little Bumblebee Stinger. I like to insert a toothpick into this or a skewer, just that way you can easily press it into the cake when the time comes. So now that our bumblebee's face is all ready to go, it's time to work on our chocolate cake layers. Now I love these cake layers because they're moist and tender, but they also have enough structure, and that's important, especially in this cake since we're going to be turning it over onto its side. To start making that cake batter, we are creaming together our butter and our sugar until it's light and fluffy, so we're mixing it on high for about 2 to 3 minutes. Next we mix in our large eggs 2 at a time just to help them mix in more easily. In a separate large bowl, we're combining our buttermilk, our hot water, and our cocoa powder. Now for this cake recipe, I like to use dark cocoa or black cocoa so that my cake layers have a really nice deep color, and you don't actually have to add any food coloring this way to give them almost like a black bumblebee vibe. However, if you can't find black cocoa or dark cocoa, don't worry, just add in a little bit of food coloring and it'll look the same. Once we've whisked those ingredients together, we're going to set that aside and sift together our dry ingredients. This includes our flour, our baking soda and baking powder, and our salt. Then we're adding half of those dry ingredients into our butter egg mixture, and we're going to mix on a medium-low speed until combined. Then we add in our wet ingredients, and for this step I like to actually start mixing on low. If you go at too high of a speed at first, the wet ingredients can kind of explode out of your bowl, so start on a low speed and then work your way up to a medium speed. And once they're mixed together, we're going to add in the remaining bit of our dry ingredients. At this point in time, I like to scrape around the sides of the bowl just to make sure everything is getting properly incorporated. And once our batter is nice and smooth, we are going to pour it into our prepared pans. For this recipe, I like to use 4 6-inch cake pans just to give our bumblebee a nice long body. You can use 7-inch cake pans, but your bumblebee will be a little bit shorter and a little bit more stout. We're then baking our cake layers in a preheated 350-degree oven for about 31 to 34 minutes, or until a toothpick inserted in the center comes out with a few moist crumbs. Now as our cake layers bake and cool, we're going to work on our honey buttercream frosting. Now I know that honey and chocolate might not sound like the most amazing combo, but it's absolutely delicious. If you're a little bit wary of it, don't worry, it tastes amazing and it really does pair together so well. You gotta trust me on this one. This frosting uses my American buttercream as its base, but we incorporate a bit of honey to stay on that bumblebee theme. We start off by creaming our butter on a medium speed until it's nice and smooth. Then we mix in our honey, our vanilla extract, and a bit of salt. Once those are mixed together, we're slowly incorporating our powdered sugar. And halfway through, I like to add in some heavy cream just to make the frosting a bit easier to mix. Then we mix in the rest of our powdered sugar, and we want to mix on a low speed at the end to make our frosting super smooth and easy to use. At this stage, we're going to scoop out about 1 cup of frosting into a separate bowl and add some of our dark or black cocoa powder and some heavy cream. We're going to mix together with a bit of black gel food coloring until our buttercream reaches a really nice deep color. Then we're going to place it in a small piping bag fit with a wide frosting tip. We're going to seal off the top of it and set it aside. That's going to be to pipe on our Bumblebees Stripes. And then to our remaining uncolored frosting, we're adding some yellow gel food coloring to create a vibrant yellow shade that I guess you could also call Bumblebee Yellow. I usually just place my frosting in a piping bag to make it easier to add onto the cake, but you can also just cover it with a piece of plastic wrap and leave it in the bowl. It all comes down to your preference. Once our cake layers are cooled, we're taking a serrated knife and we're going to level 2 of our cake layers that are going to go in the middle but the bottom and the top cake layer we're gonna leave unleveled because we want the cake to have rounded ends, so leaving a little bit of a dome is totally fine in this situation. While we set up and get everything ready to go to decorate this cake, we're gonna pop those cake layers into our freezer to let them chill for about 20 minutes. This is gonna make them so much easier to frost and eventually to flip. It's a really important step, so don't skip it. Then to assemble our cake, we're adding a dab of buttercream onto our cake board just to help stick that first cake layer in place. You only need a tiny bit because eventually we are going to scoop the cake up and flip it. So this is just to make the first part of frosting the cake easier. Then we're assembling our cake layers with the unleveled cake layer on the bottom and the top, and the 2 leveled cake layers in the middle. I'm adding a very generous layer of that honey buttercream that we've colored yellow in between our cake layers, and then I'm going to smooth the overhanging frosting around the sides of the cake and pop it into the freezer before we trim it. After letting the cake chill in the freezer for about 10 minutes or the fridge for about 30, we're taking our serrated knife and we're trimming off just about an inch from one side of the cake. We then take our bench scraper, scoop underneath the cake, and very carefully flip the cake onto its side. Now at this point, if any of your cake layers start to kind of separate or they're not sticking together all the way, I suggest inserting a wooden dowel or a straw or a chopstick into the cake layers to help keep them together. I had one cake layer on the end that kind of wanted to break away, and that really helped. Once your cake is on its side, you're gonna crumb coat the cake with a thin layer of that yellow buttercream and then pop it back into the freezer. Once the frosting is firm to the touch, we're adding on a second layer of yellow buttercream. I like to smooth it using both an offset spatula and a little acetate sheet. An acetate sheet is just a thin piece of plastic. I get them in large squares on Amazon, and then I trim them down into tiny pieces that are easier to use. They're not super expensive and they last for forever, so if you make a lot of sculpted cakes, I highly recommend trying them out. They work great. I'll include the link to the kind that I order on Amazon in the video description. And then it's time to pipe on our Bumblebees stripes. Now we're using this really wide tip here, and I recommend actually making each stripe with 2 motions up the side of the cake. It makes it so much easier to get a nice straight line, and it's super easy just to smooth out the top so that it looks really seamless. For my Bumblebee, I piped 2 stripes on. If you have a thinner piping tip, you can totally add more stripes. This is up to you, and it's all about whatever look you're going for. Our final step with this cake is just adding on all those fondant features. First, I'm pressing the stinger into the back of the cake, then I'm adding the bumblebee's eyes. Now, if you're having a hard time getting these fondant pieces to stick to your cake, I recommend adding a little bit of buttercream either onto the cake where you want to press them into place or onto the back of the bits of fondant. It'll help them stick so much better, and I usually do that when I make cakes like this. Then for the antenna and the wings, I really recommend actually pushing on the skewer as opposed to pushing on like the pieces of fondant, because a lot of times fondant can crack if it's not all the way dry. So using the skewer to press both of those into place is definitely the way to go. If you're making this cake in advance, I recommend waiting to add the wings until before you serve it. It'll just make the cake so much easier to store and transport if you need to take it somewhere. And just like that, our Bumblebee cake is all ready to go. If you want to make this Bumblebee cake at home, the recipe is included in the video description below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, happy baking!